Hi everybody, welcome to our module on the spinal cord. If you look at the skeleton on the right side of the screen and it's facing away from us, you're looking at the back and you see the spine running right down here. And if you take one of the spinous processes out and look at it, you'd see what's on the left side of the screen. So there's a bony portion that sticks out and that's called a spinous process. In the front there's a vertebral disc which is called the nucleus pulposus, and that's actually the remnant of the notochord in the embryo. But then the most important part is right in the middle, and that's the spinal cord right here. And it gives out spinal roots on both sides which come together and form a spinal nerve, and each side of the vertebral body has a nerve coming out of it, and that's called a spinal nerve. The spinal nerves are named for the portion of the body from which they emerge. So there are 8 that emerge from the cervical region, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and 5 sacral. And if you look at this picture on the left, you'll see that right around L1 and L2 here, the spinal cord ends. And that place where the spinal cord ends is called the conus medullaris. After the spinal cord ends, nerve fibers continue to run down in the spinal column, and that's called the cauda equina, which means horse's tail, and that's because these wispy fibers of nerves running down here remind people of the tail of a horse. If you take a slice through the spinal cord and stain it and put it under the microscope, you see something like what's on the left side of the screen here. And there is this structure in the middle of the spinal cord section that looks like a butterfly, and that is composed of nerve cell bodies. And all the purple stuff on the outside are nerve fibers traveling up and down in the spinal cord. Now we often draw it more like this picture over here on the right side of the screen, and we call the butterfly thing in the middle that I'm highlighting here with my pen, we call that gray matter, and that's composed of cells. And then all the white stuff here that I'm highlighting now are nerve fibers, and we call that the white matter. The gray and white matter have different appearances depending on which section of the cord you're in. So starting down here in the sacrum, you see mostly gray matter because in the sacrum there are very few fibers running up and down. As you climb into the lumbar region, you start to see more white matter because the spinal cord is collecting more fibers running up and down. In the thoracic region, you see lots of white matter because there are lots of fibers. And then there's a unique finding that always tells you you're in the thoracic section of the spinal cord, and that's this little bump right here in the gray matter. Those are called the lateral horns, and those represent cell bodies of the sympathetic nerves. Finally, when you reach the cervical region, you see largely white matter and very little gray matter. Sometimes formal terminology is used to describe the location of the elements of the spinal cord, and let me just review that so you're not confused. When we say something is dorsal, in the human, we mean that's posterior towards the back. You may know fish have a dorsal fin, and that comes off their back. When we say something is ventral, we mean it's anterior and towards the front. Something that is rostral is towards the top of the head, and something that is caudal is towards the tail, and that means away from the head. So you need to be familiar with the cell bodies found in the gray matter of the spinal cord and also some of the tracks running through the white matter. So let's talk about the cell bodies first. We divide the gray matter up into 3 general regions. The first is the posterior portion, which I'm highlighting with my pen right now. This is called the posterior horn, or it's sometimes called the dorsal horn, because remember, dorsal means posterior, and this is the posterior of the body back here. The other section, which I'm highlighting now, is called the anterior horn, or the ventral horn, because ventral and anterior mean the same thing. And then finally, this little bump out here is called the lateral horn. So there are different cell bodies in each portion of the gray matter. So in the posterior or dorsal horn, there are sensory cell bodies that collect sensory information coming from the body. Specifically, they collect information for the spinothalamic tract on pain, temperature, and touch. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The lateral horn has cell bodies for the sympathetic nervous system. So this is the way the sympathetic nervous system is going to make changes in the body, like dilating the eye or constricting a blood vessel. And then the anterior or ventral horn has motor neurons, which are going to go out and make muscles contract and do things of that nature. Now let's talk about the white matter, and the white matter contains axons running up and down the spinal cord, and there are a lot of different tracks that you can learn about, but there are 3 that are responsible for almost all of the symptoms that occur in spinal cord syndromes. The first of those is the cortical spinal tract, which is right over here, and that's carrying motor information to the spinal cord. So damage to this tract results in paralysis. These are your motor fibers running up and down in the spinal cord. The sensory information going up to the brain travels in 2 separate tracks. So in the posterior or dorsal columns, you have information on proprioception and vibration. That's called the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then over here on the side, you have the spinothalamic tract, and that's carrying information on pain, temperature, and touch. So if you just know these 3 tracks, you can figure out the majority of the clinical syndromes that happen to patients with spinal cord problems. Here's a picture showing all of the tracks running up and down in the spinal cord, and I just want to make the point that there are many more tracks than the 3 I described in the last picture. But the 3 in the last picture are the most important ones. Those are the ones that create the vast majority of symptoms in patients with spinal cord problems. So just start by knowing those 3, and then if you want to, you can go on and learn about the extrapyramidal tracks or the spino-olivary fibers or some of these other tracks that run in the spinal cord. Start with the main 3. So now what we're going to do is talk about the 3 tracks that carry information between the spinal cord and the brain. First, we'll talk about the 2 sensory tracks, which carry sensory information into the spinal cord and up to the brain. And then we'll talk about the motor tract, which is how the brain creates motor activity. So first, let's talk about the spinothalamic tract. And this is the tract in the body that carries information on pain, temperature, and crude touch. So let's look down here at this picture on the right. Out in the periphery of your body, there are free nerve endings, and those are the structures that sense pain and temperature. And they create electrical signals that travel into the spinal cord through a neuron that synapses in the posterior or dorsal horn. There it synapses with another neuron, which then carries the information up the spinal cord, through the medulla, through the pons and midbrain, and into the thalamus. All sensory information in the body, except for smell, goes through the thalamus. Once this information reaches the VPL portion of the thalamus, it synapses with a third neuron, which then takes the information up to the cortex. So this is a 3-neuron system, and both of the sensory tracts in the body use a 3-neuron system. The first neuron is from the spinal root to the cord, where it synapses. The second neuron is from the dorsal horn to the thalamus. And then the third neuron in both of the sensory tracts is from the VPL of the thalamus to the cortex. Important things to know about this tract are that it crosses right at the level where the sensory information enters the spinal cord. So if you have damage to any of this tract rising up to the thalamus, you will lose pain and temperature sensation on the opposite side of the body. And that is because of that crossing right at the level of the spinal cord where the information enters the spinal column. So now let's talk about the second important sensory pathway in the body, and that's called the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. And that's a mouthful, so many people just call it the posterior column. So let's look down here at the picture on the right. You have structures called Meissner's corpuscles out in your periphery, and these are structures that sense touch. And you have other structures called Pacinian corpuscles that sense vibration and pressure. And when they get stimulated, they are going to send nerve information into the spinal cord. But different from the spinothalamic tract, these fibers are not going to synapse in the posterior horn. Instead, they're going to ascend in the posterior section of the spinal cord. That's called the posterior column. From there, they're going to go up to the lower medulla, where they are going to synapse with 2 important structures called the nucleus cuneatus and the nucleus gracilis. And the nucleus cuneatus gets most of the information from the arms, and the nucleus gracilis gets most of the information from the thorax and lower extremities. After the synapse, a second neuron is then going to decussate and cross to the other side of the medulla, where it's then going to ascend through the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain and go up to the thalamus, and then it will synapse in the thalamus. And from there, the information gets to the cortex. So let's look over here on the left. Just like the spinothalamic tract, this is a 3-neuron system. The first neuron is in the periphery and then sends information up the cord. The second neuron is from the gracilis or the cuneatus up to the thalamus. And then the third neuron, just like the spinothalamic tract, is from the VPL portion of the thalamus to the cortex. And this is carrying sensory information on vibration, proprioception, and fine touch. Now, a key point here about this system, if you have damage in the spinal cord below the decussation, say right here, you will lose proprioception and vibration on the same side of the body as the lesion. On the other hand, if you have damage in the brainstem, in the medulla or the pons or the midbrain or up in the cortex, you will lose proprioception and vibration sensation on the opposite side of the body. So make sure you understand that. So just to review how sensory information from the world gets up to your brain, it's carried by 2 pathways. The spinothalamic tract carries pain, temperature, and crude touch. Those peripheral neurons synapse at the cord level and then cross at the cord level and ascend to the brain. The other information is carried in the posterior column. That's vibration, proprioception, and fine touch. Those peripheral neurons ascend in the cord in the posterior columns. They synapse in the medulla at the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, and then they cross at the medulla. So a key point is that they both cross to the opposite side, but in different places. So now let's talk about the motor tract in the spinal cord, and that's called the corticospinal tract. So look over here on the right up at the top at the cortex, and let's suppose your cortex decides it wants to create a motor action in your body. It will send a signal down through the cortex through a structure called the internal capsule, And then those fibers will descend through the midbrain, pons, and the medulla on the same side of the body as the cortex. And then in the lower medulla they will cross, and that's called the decussation. And then they will descend in the spinal cord and then synapse in the anterior horn at the level of the spinal cord where they want to create an activity. A second neuron then will carry the signal out to the periphery and innervate the motor so that you get the motor activity that you want. So important things to know about this system is that it's a two-neuron system. The first neuron is from the cortex to the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and the second neuron is from the anterior horn to the muscle. And then also important to know is that there's a decussation in the lower medulla, so that if you look over here on the right, lesions in the brainstem up to the cortex create motor loss on the opposite side of the body. On the other hand, lesions in the spinal cord create motor loss on the same side of the body. So let's review the 6 key points you should remember about the gray and white matter of the spinal cord. And we'll start with the gray matter first. Remember that the anterior horn is what contains motor nerve. So down here in this picture on the right, I've put the number 1 in the anterior horn. It's sometimes called the ventral horn, and those are your motor nerves that innervate muscles. Point 2 is that the posterior horn contains sensory nerves for pain and temperature. Let's look down here on the right. I've drawn the number 2 in the posterior horn, sometimes called the dorsal horn. And remember, that's where those spinal thalamic fibers synapse, and then they cross right below the spinal canal before going and ascending on the other side of the spinal cord. Point 3 is that the lateral horn is what contains the sympathetic nerves. So look down here, I've drawn the number 3 where the lateral horn would be. It's actually not shown in this drawing. It would be a little bump here on the lateral portion of the gray matter. And the lateral horn is only found in the thoracic portion of the spine because that's where the sympathetic system leaves the spinal cord to synapse with sympathetic ganglia. Point 4 is that the spinothalamic tract carries pain and temperature information, and I've drawn the number 4 over here laterally where you would find the spinothalamic tract fibers. Point 5 is that the medial lemniscus pathway carries vibration and proprioception. So down here in this picture, point 5 is in the back. That's this section back here. It's technically called the posterior column in the spinal cord, and then it's called the medial lemniscus in the brainstem, but most people just call it the posterior column for simplicity's sake. And then point 6 is that the corticospinal tract carries your motor fibers, and down here in this picture the 6 is over here, and that's where the bulk of your motor nerve fibers are running through the spinal cord. So let's talk about how you test the different senses of the body. So the first test we use is called the Romberg, and this is a test of proprioception. So you have the patient stand with arms by their side and you have them close their eyes and you see if they can maintain their balance. Sometimes you give them a very gentle push and see if they can maintain their balance. If the patient has poor proprioception, they will be using their vision to maintain balance. And when you ask them to close their eyes, therefore you take away their vision, they will become unbalanced. So this is a test of the posterior column. Vibration is tested with a tuning fork. You start it vibrating and you place it on different portions of the body and see if the patient can feel it. You can test proprioception directly in addition to the Romberg test by just asking the patient to close their eyes, and then you move their toe up and down several times and then stop and ask them if they can detect whether it's up or down with their eyes closed. You can test pain with a pinprick, and then temperature is very rarely tested, but you would do it by asking the patient to put their fingers or their toes in hot or cold water. And then finally, don't get confused about patients with diabetes who have peripheral neuropathy and think that it's a spinal cord problem. So you will often see patients with diabetes and they will lose sensation to pinprick at their feet. But as you start to test pinprick further up the leg, the sensation will get better. In fact, usually the sensation to pinprick is intact above the knee. So when it changes going up the leg like that, it's a peripheral neuropathy. It is not a spinal cord problem. And this can especially be tricky in board questions. You'll see a description of a patient in a STEM who's lost pinprick sensation in their feet, and you will start thinking of which spinal cord tract must be involved. But if you read the question carefully and they tell you that pinprick is better as you get further up the leg, then you know that it's peripheral neuropathy and not a spinal cord lesion. And that concludes our module on the spinal cord.